Imagine a punishment where your own body becomes the weapon against you. In 1347, a Persian woman named Fatima learned this horror. She was locked inside an iron mask, but not one that simply imprisoned. Its interior was lined with spikes, precisely positioned millimeters from her eyes. For 6 months, she lived in a state of frozen terror. Every natural instinct, to turn towards a sound, to glance at a loved one, could drive the metal into her eyes, blinding her. This was her sentence for a crime we all commit every day, the simple, human act of looking. In 1347, a woman named Fatima stood before a judge, not for a crime she committed, but for a crime her eyes had allegedly committed. The evidence of her sentence was dried upon her face. Blood was crusted around her eyes, a brutal reminder of the iron mask that had just been removed after 6 long months. This device was not a simple tool of justice. It was an instrument of deliberate and calculated cruelty, designed not to kill, but to mutilate. Its internal spikes were calibrated to punish the most natural of human instincts, the desire to look around. For half a year, Fatima had lived in a state of constant tension, where a single turn of her head could mean permanent blindness. Her presence in the courtroom that day posed a silent, powerful question. What possible offense could justify such a horrific punishment, one that forced a person to choose between seeing the world and keeping their eyesight? But Fatima's story was not unique. It was part of a hidden epidemic that spanned continents and centuries, all starting with a single, twisted legal justification. The justification for this torture wasn't found in a dungeon, but in a legal text. It was called Namus. In the elite circles of 9th century Abbasid Caliphate, Namus did not mean honor in a personal sense. It meant honor as a form of ownership. Under this concept, a woman's gaze itself was considered property, belonging first to her father and then to her husband. For her to look freely upon the world was seen as a form of theft from her male guardians. This idea created a deep paradox, as it emerged from one of history's most advanced civilizations, a society renowned for its achievements in science and mathematics. Yet, this intellectual sophistication was twisted to create a brutal device for social control. This legal loophole allowed a device of pure horror to be classified not as a weapon, but as something far more sinister in the eyes of the law. In a stunning act of legal deception, the iron mask was not categorized as a torture device. Court records labeled it as protective clothing. The law cleverly framed it not as a punishment, but as a corrective measure. Its stated purpose was to safeguard a woman's modesty by physically preventing her from looking at men outside her family. This clever language provided a moral excuse for the men who applied it, allowing them to believe they were acting for the woman's own good and the protection of family honor. This perversion of logic, where a tool of extreme pain was called a form of protection, became the bedrock of the entire practice. It gave a legal and social cover for unimaginable cruelty. Once this door of legal fiction was opened, it allowed for the creation of a device whose mechanics were more chilling than any executioner's axe. This was no crude cage. It was a masterpiece of medieval engineering, designed with terrifying precision. The mask was a carefully crafted iron shell that enclosed the head. Inside, 12 sharp spikes were positioned with chilling accuracy. 6 spikes pointed towards the right eye and 6 towards the left, each one ending exactly 3 millimeters from the wearer's cornea when her head was held perfectly straight. This tiny distance, the width of just 2 human hairs, was the difference between sight and a life-changing injury. The device was sealed at the back with a lock that only a guardian, a father, husband, or religious authority could open. The cold, calculated craftsmanship involved in its creation showed that this was not a tool of passion, but one of deliberate and measured control. But the true psychological terror lay not in the spikes themselves, but in the diabolical choice they forced upon the wearer. The mask's design had one fundamental rule: movement brings its own punishment. A woman trapped inside it could not act on any natural impulse. The simple human need to turn towards a sound, to look up at the sky, or to glance at the person speaking to her became a potentially blinding act. If she turned her head to the right, the spikes on the left would press forward, threatening her eye. The same was true for any movement. A 9th century scholar named Al-Jahiz described these iron veils as tools that teach patience through proximity to consequence. This meant a woman lived every moment with the direct and immediate result of her actions just a hair's breadth from her eyes. She was made the instrument of her own torture, where a moment of forgetfulness could cause permanent damage. Surviving this device required superhuman stillness. But for the women who endured it, losing their sight was often only the beginning of their losses. So what was the punishable offense? The court records from the time reveal a truth more absurd than you can imagine. The documented crimes that led to the Iron Mask were not acts of violence or rebellion. They were simple, everyday moments of human interaction. A woman could be accused for looking at a merchant while she was shopping for fabric. Another was punished for briefly glancing at a male pilgrim during a religious journey. Making eye contact with a servant who was not a family member was also considered a serious violation. The famous traveler Ibn Battuta wrote of seeing these masked women and, when he asked what they had done, was given a simple, chilling explanation. They looked. Their only crime was using their eyes to see the world around them. But a pattern emerges from these records that exposes the absurdity. The victims weren't random. They were almost exclusively women who had recently come into a fortune. When you ask who benefited, the conspiracy unravels. The target was not a woman's morality, but her money. Under the law, women, especially widows, could indeed inherit property and wealth from their husbands or fathers. This legal right, however, became their greatest vulnerability. The pattern is clear. A wealthy widow would be accused of an immodest gaze. She would then be placed in the Iron Mask, and the near-inevitable injury would soon follow. Once blinded, she was declared legally incapable of managing her own business affairs, properties, or trade contracts. This allowed a male relative, a brother-in-law, a son, or a cousin, to petition the court for guardianship, effectively seizing control of her inheritance. In one documented case from the 1340s, 3 widows from the same wealthy merchant family were all accused and masked within 6 months. All 3 were injured, and their late husbands' businesses were transferred to a single male cousin. This was financial fraud disguised as piety, and the key to proving it was found not in a courtroom, but in a craftsman's ledger. The ultimate proof lay in the cost. The masks were astronomically expensive. Receipts from the time show that a single iron mask cost the equivalent of what a skilled craftsman would earn over 6 months of hard work. This high price tag exposes the true motive. If the goal was truly moral correction, a simple and cheap confinement would have sufficed. Such a massive investment only makes sense if the mask was not the product, but the tool to acquire a much larger prize. The math was cold and simple. Spend 6 months' wages on a specialized mask to gain legal control over an inheritance worth a fortune. This was not an act of religious fervor. It was a calculated business transaction. This financial paper trail was the evidence Fatima needed to turn her personal tragedy into a weapon against the entire system. While others accepted their fate, Fatima al-Samarkandi decided to speak, and her words would echo through history. Standing before the court with her injured eye, she began with a powerful statement. I testify that I was placed in the iron veil, not for the protection of my modesty, but for the theft of my inheritance. She did not merely plead her own case. She came prepared with evidence that exposed a widespread conspiracy. Fatima presented a list of 23 other women, all widows from wealthy families, who had suffered the same fate. She then revealed the craftsman's receipts, proving the immense cost of the masks and linking their purchase directly to the male relatives who stood to inherit. Her testimony connected the dots between the accusers, the judges who approved the sentences, and the craftsmen who profited from creating the devices, revealing an entire system built on fraudulent theft. Her testimony was so powerful, so undeniable, that it forced the most powerful man in the empire to confront an ugly truth and take action. In 1348, Sultan Abu Sa'id issued a decree that officially banned the iron masks forever. Confronted with the evidence of systematic fraud, his ruling was unequivocal. He condemned the devices as instruments of false piety, masking true theft. The decree ordered all existing masks to be destroyed and stripped the guardianship rights from any man who had profited from a woman's masking and subsequent injury. For a moment it seemed like a definitive victory for justice and a death sentence for the cruel practice. But banning a device on paper was one thing. Erasing a 900-year-old practice from the shadows was another. The masks didn't vanish. They just went underground. The story was presumed to be a dark legend until 2019, when a real mask was found in a Vienna estate sale. A private collector had acquired it, mistaking it for a piece of unusual medieval armor. Curious researchers at the Museum of Islamic Art in Berlin later conducted a full analysis. Metallurgical tests confirmed the iron's composition matched 14th century Persian metalwork. The most chilling discovery was the confirmation of its brutal precision. The internal spikes were still positioned exactly 3 millimeters from where a person's corneas would rest. Etched faintly on the inside was an inscription that revealed its true purpose: for the correction of the wayward. This was not a replica. It was a genuine instrument of torture from Fatima's time. Today, that mask sits in a museum archive deemed too disturbing for public display, a final ironic act of hiding a history that demands to be seen. The Iron Mask is not a relic. It is a warning. Its story reveals a timeless pattern of control, where appeals to morality and honor are used as a pretext to limit women's autonomy and economic freedom. The same underlying mechanism that used the language of protection to justify blinding a wealthy widow continues today. In various modern contexts, strict dress codes and laws enforcing modesty are often weaponized not for virtue, but for social control, to restrict women's participation in public life and to maintain patriarchal power structures. The tools have changed, but the strategy of disguising oppression as protection remains. The story of the Iron Mask teaches us to always look past the stated reason for a punishment and ask the one question the powerful never want answered: who truly benefits?